My argument is that the creation of the other by the media essentially enables the government to implement policies that do not comply with the United Nations Refugee Rights Convention. I say that this occurs in an environment of very little scrutiny, and it's interesting and concerning that on both sides of politics and throughout the community, the refugee asylum seeker question is only ever conceived as problematic. No acknowledgement ever seems to be given to the human capital that these people represent. And even those petitioning energetically for faster processing, no detention facilities, and a more liberal set of criteria do so from a fundamentally pessimistic standpoint. My argument is that this negativity works against them from the start and dictates the terms of reference by and through which the entire discourse proceeds. It's reported that over 90% of TV viewers watch news programs on free-to-air television, and over an included third access news through social media. With this in mind, I argue that the dominant political discourse is therefore played out to a mass audience, and that distinct social and political stakeholders are influencing this content. Online news content is now the second highest media activity after broadcast television. This obviously has a big impact on how the refugee debate is conceived. Let's look at the impact that the construction of these identities has had on refugee rights and how the media has played a role in that. Australian society is built on many dichotomies, and as spoken by Haddon, borders define belonging. So therefore the dichotomies of us and them, friend and enemy, are essential and inextricable notions of human psychology. I think that the creation of the other as a means to include and exclude certain identities from regular society is seen clearly in the terminology used by the mainstream media. In particular, introduction of words such as boat people, illegal immigrants, terrorists and queue jumpers, trafficked people. Refugees challenge the notion of borders, and it's this challenge which sparks the reaction in the media as one of fear and insecurity. Here's an example of how Dr. Keith Sutter explains the fear within Australian society through mainstream media.
One of the former heads of the Department of Foreign Affairs actually wrote a book called The Frightened Country. Yep. And it emphasised the way in which Australia, which was on the edge of the British Empire, a long way from our ally, the UK or the United States, we seem to be, felt very isolated, very vulnerable, and there is therefore this fear of invasion, which is very much within our body politic, and which politicians from both ends of the spectrum find it useful to explore.
I think a paradox exists within Australia in that we promote ourselves as being a tolerant and multicultural society. But in reality, Australia has been the birthplace of several racially biased policies, such as the White Australia policy and mandatory detention of refugees, both of which violate human rights. The very essence of multiculturalism has been seen as a threat to social cohesion, exemplified no more so than in Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party, which we're all familiar with. These reflect a sense of insecurity that is deeply embedded into Australian society and is reflective of a latent racism based on the fear of invasion. And this stems right back to Federation and the introduction of the Immigration Restriction Act as outlined by Caroline Flay. I'd also like to point out that the ambiguity of the definition in the 1951 and 67 conventions allows for some pointed misrepresentation and manipulation of refugee rights by policymakers. So the convention states that persons in fear of persecution, etc., are eligible to apply for asylum. But the fact is that most of the world's forced migrants do not fulfill the convention criteria as they've not yet crossed a border, or the reason they are fleeing is because of war or generalized violence, as opposed to the individual persecution which the convention states. So this allows for serious gaps to emerge in the comprehensiveness of the Convention for Refugee Rights. Women, for example, whom are persecuted based on their gender, are also not necessarily protected, nor are internally displaced persons or those escaping natural disasters. So we can see here that the wording of this document effectively writes people in or out of their rights as a refugee or an asylum seeker. This indeterminacy permits a particular language with all of its connotations of suspicion, threats, aliens, others, and such to proliferate, and I argue that under a more robust convention, the language would force it to be tightened. Security concerns are perpetuated through political language, and this suits the conservative approach of the Australian media. The fear of the other has been nurtured through sensationalist, conservative and popular media. According to Gelber and MacDonald, the government has always been in a particularly strong position to define the nature of Australia's approach and to construct public opinion. In fact, the term asylum seeker is becoming interchangeable with illegal immigrants, and we know that for the most part of the 20th century, Australian immigration has been racially exclusionary. So the use of fear through the media to inform Australia's sovereign right to exclude those who threaten our core values has become a daily occurrence. And some would argue that immigration control overrides obligations of refugee protection. There's no question that successive governments have sought to turn the issue of asylum seekers to their political advantage. There's many examples of this, some of which I'll look at shortly. And whilst I'm not saying the security of the nation or the protection of borders is not reasonable, what's interesting and needs to be looked at here is the sensational reports by the media and the construction of labels within the Australian culture that then is used to create othering and ultimately deny people of their human rights. So the numbers just simply don't equate to the amount of media bravado dedicated to the topic. From 1989 to 1997, a period of 8 years, only 700 people who arrived in Australia as asylum seekers actually even stayed, though through media coverage and stereotyping and labelling, Australians have proceeded to become conditionally feared to the arrival of asylum seekers. We've always insisted that people have visas before they arrive, but the language of the media certainly doesn't depict the real reasons behind these people's fleeing, and words such as invasion, floods of people, threats to the border has just increased and heightened the level of anxiety within the public. Perversely, there is an element, I think, of a wishing terrorist attack upon us, because then it perhaps lends us a legitimacy on the world stage.
Smugglers are gearing up for a record run. As Brian Seymour reports, the smugglers, their boats and their new fast-track customers are ready to set sail.
The government has recently responded to the fear of an influx by creating the No Advantage campaign, which we'll look at in a moment. The fact of the matter is, all nations must accept those that come to their shores, no matter how they arrive. It's not illegal to seek asylum, and there's no queue that's often referred to, especially in the media, queue jumpers and etc. So, as a signatory of the UN, Australia has an obligation to protect those who ask for protection, and they're supposed to do that in a timely and just manner. Fear created by the media, supported by government movements, has directly violated Australia's obligations to the UN Convention, or at least played a significant role. In 1992, mandatory detention became law, and in 1994, we saw the beginning of indefinite detention. And there's plenty of shock jock popularist journalism regarding this topic. In 1995, the Chief Justice of Family Courts described the detention centre at Port Hedland to be a virtual concentration camp. Let's take a look at the 2013 No Advantage campaign and notice the language they use, people waiting, referring again to that mystical queue.
There is no advantage in paying a people smuggler to travel to Australia.
The message to asylum seekers is simple, direct and blunt.
No advantage. Boat arrivals will not be processed faster than people waiting in refugee camps.
I'd like to look now at how labels have been created, shaped and reshaped by the media. The prolific categorisation of people's experiences for administrative purposes has resulted in difficulty in people obtaining the refugee status, so much so that it's now become somewhat of a prized term through this continued politicisation. So in order to keep control, governments need to make very clear distinctions, and that goes back to the dichotomies we were speaking of earlier. These labels are therefore the result of political negotiations and decisions that then meet legal and political goals. Refugee and asylum seekers have become increasingly newsworthy since November 2001 and the federal election. The succession of events such as the Tampa incident, Civex, the September 11 attacks, all flared intense debates during the federal election, and the promises of stopping the boats and securing the nation's security have only ever increased since. Zeta outlines how labels are tangible representations of policies and programs that are predicated on highly instrumental practices which serve the interest of the state. Labels are used to describe the world and also used to construct convenient images. The politicising of refugee status reveals a complex web of political, social and economic factors that inform the creation of such terms as asylum seeker, queue jumpers and boat people. The vocabulary is varied in its scope, but singular in its covert intention, as outlined by Zeta, and that is to convey an image of marginality, dishonesty, threats and unwelcome people. I think these labels bring us back to the core argument here, and that's one of fear. Fear used to create the other in the media, and that is then essentially enabling the government to implement policies that do not comply with the United Nations Refugee Rights Convention. I think this fear has manifested itself into the everyday psyche of the Australian culture, so that these policies then take place in an environment of very little scrutiny because people are afraid by what they've seen and been told in the media. Here's a couple of examples of how money and the cost has been used to instill fear and worry.
There was a time when Tony Abbott offered to support an increase in Australia's refugee intake, but times have changed.
We can't afford it. It's as simple as that.
9 News can reveal the true welfare cost to Australian taxpayers. A special investigation has uncovered the massive Centrelink bill to care for our new refugees.
The opposition leader says he will cut numbers by 6,000 and make asylum seekers work for their welfare.
The over-politicising of this issue has resulted in the general public becoming less sympathetic and empathetic towards asylum seekers outside of pointed current affairs. As mentioned before, there's no question that successive governments have sought to turn this issue into their political advantage. Not a night, or barely a night goes by where the issue is not dealt with on nearly every station on TV and radio.
Only real action will stop illegal immigration. We've got to take stronger measures now.
Or stop the boat.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
So the fear created by the media is now underpinning some of the refugee policies, such as offshore processing, mandatory detention and exclusion zones within Australian water. And an interesting article at civex.org talks about the Civex disaster being rather a wishful sinking, so that this fear could then be used to underwrite the policies. And then the introduction of temporary protection visas mirrors an increasingly fraught situation in Australian policy. The media coverage of Civex, children overboard, the Tampa disasters has then caused an emergence of pro-human rights protesting in Australia, which we've seen grow and grow.
In Australia, people who would throw their own children into the sea, I don't. There's something to me incompatible between somebody who claims to be a refugee and somebody who would throw their own child into the sea. It offends the natural instinct of protection.
So we've seen many examples of how the media has manifested this fear and othering that's then writing people in or out of their human rights, basically. It would seem that to combat the construction of policy based on fear, that we need to remove the threat of danger and harm from all these convenient images and labels that are incessantly created and projected through the media, and rather instead focus on the human capital that these people offer us and how best we can serve humanity and fulfil Australia's obligations as a responsible signatory of the United Nations.